get this started, thank you to everyone who's joining us today, and welcome to this talk called Unlearning Cissexism and the Gender Binary. I'm Tiffany O'Shaughnessy. I'm the current collective coordinator for the Association for Women in Psychology. My pronouns are she, her, and I am going to be turning this over to Nic Johnson and Elyssa Klann, who are going to be giving this talk, and then Gia Davis is here as well, going to be monitoring the chat and sort of helping to contribute to the presentation as well. And so I think the big, just some housekeeping things. The chat is going to be open. There's going to be some interactive pieces to this session. And so you're welcome to put whatever you want in the chat. We are recording this session for folks who weren't able to be here. We'll put it up on our AWP YouTube channel. But that the information that is in the chat won't be visible in that recording. And so whenever we do share stuff out of the chat, we'll just say a person said, so your names won't be connected to that. If you have questions for the presenters or questions that you want to have discussion about, you can also use the Q&A function to put your questions in there. We'd ask if it is a question that you use that. It should be at the bottom of your screen. If you put a question in the chat, it might get lost in all of the reactions that are coming in. We're hoping it's interactive in that way. So the Q&A is available. We'll make sure there's space at the end today for that. Also, there is a live transcript. So if you need closed captioning, you should be able to click that and it'll put captions up for you. So those are, I think that's all I need to do. So I'm going to pass it over to Nic and Elyssa and Gia.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. Again, I just want to echo what Tiffany said. We're going to start with introductions and community agreements because we think these are really important. This can be a really challenging conversation for folks for a variety of reasons. And so we want to make sure that we, one, are getting what you're hoping to get out of this session met, but also that you feel safe within this session. And a point that I want to make is, I think it's really important to distinguish between feeling safe and feeling comfortable. I think those are two different things. And I encourage all of us during this time to sort of push ourselves into that discomfort because we know that's really where growth comes from, but we don't want anybody to feel unsafe. So I'm Nic Johnson. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be one of the co-facilitators with you here today. What am I hoping to get out of the session? We did this session at AWP, and it was such a really wonderful connecting experience and learning experience for myself, and I think for others who are involved. And so I'm just hoping to keep that momentum going, and so keep growing with you all. And something that helps me feel safe is knowing that people see my humanity, which basically means sort of being allowed to make mistakes and own those mistakes at the same time. But so kind of not judging me based on one thing I say, but please I welcome accountability and feedback, but allowing me to sort of make those mistakes and be able to still move forward with my humanity intact. So I'll pass it over to Elyssa.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Elyssa Klann. I use she, her pronouns. I'm hoping to use this time to kind of connect with you all. I think AWP can be such a wonderful space, and sometimes I wish I had that space more than just once at the conference every year. So hoping to use this time to connect with you all, to learn together, to talk about some important topics together. And what helps me feel safe is I think the more I get a sense of where other people are coming from. So the more that I see other people engaging, the more that I see other people sharing and pushing themselves out of their comfort zones, the more I feel like I can as well. And I will say another thing that helps me feel safe is having a moderator. So big thanks to Gia for being here, and I'll pass it to you, Gia. Do you want to introduce yourself? Okay.
Sure. Thanks. Hi, I'm Gia Davis. My pronouns are they, them. And what am I hoping to get out of this session? Yeah, I think being in community is a big one for me. I love AWP. I've been coming since 2013. So this is the space that I treasure in a lot of ways. And what would help me feel safe in this session? I learned this concept of dialogues, not debates. And the idea of coming to have a conversation, not to prove oneself wrong or the other person right. And I find that that is like something that really helps me, feeling like everyone is on the same page about wanting to have a conversation rather than win a conversation.
Mhm. Great. So I think we want to invite you all, if you would be willing to put some of this information in the chat, name and pronouns, what you're hoping to get out of the session, what would help you feel safe. We'll give you all a minute or two if you want to share that information.
Maybe while folks are sharing in the chat, I could do mine, and that gives some time for that as well. So I already said my name and pronouns, Tiffany O'Shaughnessy, she, her. And what I'm hoping to get out of this session. So similarly, I attended the short one. I didn't make it to the full pre-conference workshop that you all did of this at in Chicago this year, and I found it really helpful to sort of just a space for me to keep digging in at like, what are my biases and what do I bring to this, and sort of just questioning assumptions. So I found that to be really helpful. I hope to get more of that, to just sort of do my own work around unlearning cissexism, and things that help me feel safe. I think similar, I loved what you said around that dialogue versus debate part. I think what helps me feel safe. Oh no, the chat is disabled. I just saw that. All right.
Yeah, we're getting lots of.
Okay, I will stop talking and fix that because my actual role is tech support. Sorry, y'all. Thanks for bearing with us. I'll work on that.
Maybe while Tiffany works on that, we can sort of start just talking about is it open now?
It should be fixed.
Okay, great. Go ahead and
try
the chat again. Yay!
Speedy, Tiffany, thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. So yeah, we'll just stay here then, and please feel free to write your name, your pronouns, what you're hoping to get out of this session, and what would help you feel safe. Awesome. I see a lot of really great comments. I see a lot of people wanting to sort of undo the binary within themselves, and also figure out how to be a more inclusive clinician. Those are really great. And we hope that we can help you a little bit with that today.
Excellent. Why don't we, maybe we'll start moving on to the next slide, but please feel free to continue sharing in the chat, and we'll lift up some responses that we see if we remember to go back and forth from the chat to the slides. So thank you all for sharing so far. Great. Okay, I'm going to be muting and unmuting myself because my dog is here and we're having some work done on our house. So hopefully I won't do the thing where I just start talking when I'm on mute, but bear with me if I do. So the first thing that we thought would be helpful to do is to bring forward some terminology. So the two terms that we really want to focus on here today, because this is what we're going to be really talking about, is cissexism and the gender binary. And cissexism is basically just like a framework that assumes that cisgender, which is the idea, with cisgender is what you were assigned at birth, you identify with that identity, is the only or the right form of gender and or sex. It often involves prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination against folks who don't fall within that cisgender realm.
So we're really going to be talking about what are the effects of this and how can you work on unlearning this within yourself. The gender binary kind of fits closely with cissexism in that it's this idea that, and this can include both trans and cis folks, there can be this sort of idea of the gender binary with folks regardless of gender identity. But it's this idea that the options are either women or girls or men and boys, and those are the only options. So we have sort of these two categories, and maybe we might even have some flexibility around the idea that somebody might be assigned a sex that they don't fit with, but the only other option then is to transition to the other sex. There's not this idea of more fluidity in gender or complexity in gender. So I have a great resource that my lab actually put together that has a variety of terms described. So I'm just going to go ahead and put it in the chat for you all to take a look at whenever you want to and just have it as a resource. But we also wanted to sort of bring up this question of, are there any words regarding gender that you've heard that you don't know what they mean? And really, we want this to be a place, again, of learning. So please feel free to be honest if you have any questions of words that might be helpful for us to define for you. So if you do, feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat now, and we can talk about them.
In the meantime, one thing I'll say about language that I think has been helpful to correct within myself around this idea of the gender binary, and something that aligns with the APA bias-free language guidelines is, rather than saying opposite sex or opposite gender, moving to say multiple genders or all genders, or something that doesn't reinforce this idea that men and women are the only options and are complete opposites from each other. I think opposite sex or opposite gender, always, I hear it a lot, and it gets me.
I think that's a really important point, because it's not only this factor that there's only two genders, but it's that those genders are in complete opposition to one another, which I think is a really important point. Yeah. I heard, so we have a comment about the word TERF. Yeah, so I think this is a term that definitely within AWP there's some controversy and kind of various feelings around. The acronym of TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. So that's what it literally translates to. It's an acronym, and the way that it's been used is this idea of people who identify with feminism, but really see it at this sort of with this binary view of that you are, and sort of going back to the cissexist view, even that we need to focus on women, and particularly, and even some people might say what is a woman? And there's some argument that what a woman is somebody who is assigned female at birth. And so there's some feminists who believe that, and that's kind of what they believe feminism should be focused on and about. And then there's some people who are maybe inclusive of maybe trans women, but sort of feel like gender non-binary or trans men shouldn't be included in our conversation around feminism. And so that might also fall within that category of TERF. So that's sort of my understanding and recollection of it. Elyssa, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. I think the comment, I mean, there are, I think everyone might have their own orientation towards the word, and that's okay. But the kind of feminism that we're going to be talking about today, and the feminism that we hope we can continue to be our legacy in AWP, is more of a gender liberation feminism framework, which includes gender liberation for all people of all genders, rather than a trans exclusionary feminism. Yeah.
And I think it's important to say that, again, I think the people who might have more of a trans exclusionary radical feminist view, I think there's a variety of reasons for that. And so I think it's important for us to also be thinking of that and be mindful of what is the reason that that we feel like we need to exclude trans folks from this conversation, and unpacking that, I think, might really help us be able to move forward. Because I know some of it is based in fear of, if we are more inclusive, if we think about gender liberation as a broader construct, are we then going to forget about the impacts of cis women? And for me, I really think about it in the opposite way. I think the more that we think about inclusion around gender and gender liberation, actually the bigger that we're gonna, like, the more impact that we're gonna see, and the more liberation for, including for cis women. But I get that that's a fear that some people have.
Mhm. Okay, why don't we keep going, and if you have more questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll try to come back to them at the end.
So we're going to start with an exercise for you all. And I think what I want to start with by saying is that this exercise is really for you. So the more honest, the more vulnerable you can be, the better it will be for you. And we're not going to ask you to share out anything. We're going to ask some overall questions that you're welcome to share about, but you do not have to share anything that you don't feel comfortable. So I really encourage you to kind of dig within yourself during this exercise. So the first thing I kind of want us all to do is go ahead and take a deep breath and exhale, and maybe do a couple of those to kind of ground ourselves in this moment. And then I'm going to invite you to do whatever feels best for you to kind of get in touch with yourself. So that might be kind of this idea of going inward. So maybe closing your eyes and sort of taking a minute to go in. It might be maybe movement to kind of get yourself in a looser place. Whatever feels right for you. I invite you to go ahead and do that in this moment. Okay. So for this exercise, I'm going to read a series of words or phrases. And what I want you to do is, on your computer or on a piece of paper, whatever feels more kind of free-flowing for you, I invite you to just write down whatever comes up when I say that word. Again, the best thing to do is to really push yourself to say that thing that comes up, even if it feels shameful, even if it feels problematic, even if it feels confusing. Just write whatever comes up throughout these, and keep writing until I say the next word. Okay. I'm going to give everybody a second to pull up a piece of paper or a Word document. All right, so the first word is trans. What are gender binary people really like? Gender non-binary people really like? Gender is. Agender. Trans women are. Women are. Genderqueer. Okay, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and just look at what you have written down. And notice if there's any themes that come up or things that surprised you, things that you feel curious about. And then whenever you feel comfortable, I encourage you, if you want to, although no one is required to put any of that in the chat. So any themes that you noticed, any things that felt surprising, any emotions that came up during this exercise. I see one person said, kept coming back to the word open. Definitely understand that. The second prompt was like anything that surprised you. Or the second prompt that I said was like the word that I said. I'm not sure which you're asking about. Sorry. Self-discovery. Oh, cool. Catchphrases. Gender is a construct, tear it apart. Trans is beautiful. Wonderful. Again, gender is a construct, kind of a theme coming up. And then trans is brave. Yeah, we currently live in a society where, unfortunately, that feels like a requirement. Yeah. Which something we hope to figure out is how can we in AWP make it so it doesn't have to be brave.
Mm-hmm. So identities are under attack. Yeah, it kind of goes with that needing for bravery, right? Kind of not sure about what even terms mean. So maybe going back to some of that terminology confusion. Great. Thanks for sharing, y'all. Yeah. Right. All right, well, we're going to keep moving along, but we encourage you to think about and continue to reflect on what came up for you and where that might mean you want more growth to happen, or what you want to do about what came up for you. And that might be nothing, but it could be something. Okay. So we want to talk about some of the kind of background of the gender binary. And I think particularly we know that as an organization and as feminists, all of us should be joined on this fight against white supremacy. And some people might see white supremacy as completely different than issues of gender, completely separate. But actually, when looking into kind of the historical context of the gender binary, we can see that they're very closely intertwined. So before colonization, many different cultures around the world had multiple genders. There's actually a great map, which maybe I can pull up and put in the chat, that shows various cultures around the world who had gender labels other than man or woman, or man and woman, and that there was a wide variety of gender expression, gender identity, sexuality, sexual expression. Unfortunately, during the process of colonization, kind of gender and race got subsumed into a categorization structure and a hierarchy that encouraged the subjugation of certain people, and it encouraged a really strict categorization. So research from an academic named Kyla Schuler. She did some historical research onto race scientists, quote unquote, in the 1800s, who actually argued that in the process of their understanding of evolution, that certain societies were more evolved than others. And unsurprisingly, based on their racial biases at the time, these white male scientists argued that white societies were the most evolved, and that one of the markers of being a most evolved society was having two completely binary, distinct genders. And so they actually argued that whereas in white societies, there's a gender binary, in societies for people of color, as they would have kind of called less advanced societies, people were less distinguished based on gender, that there was less differentiation. And this all went along with this project of essentializing gender and race, that if you have a certain skin color, if you have a certain set of genitals, that wasn't just at face value, that meant something very deep about who you were, that having a certain set of genitals represented things about your personality, that having a certain skin color represented things about your intelligence. And all of these, like both racial and gender differences, were kind of combined to create this hierarchical system. And we can see how even today, if you're familiar with the tenets of white supremacy culture, things like binary thinking, perfectionism, either or dichotomies, that a lot of white supremacy culture attributes serve to reinforce the gender binary and allow us very little room to expand and add nuance to our gender identity and our gender expression. So I'm going to put that link in the chat as well. Oh, I realize I'm only, thanks, Gia. Yeah. I was only sending it to, thank you. So yeah, so this is not, the gender binary is not sort of a neutral invention. It's an invention that was perpetuated to create harm and to create the subjugation of people of color across the globe. So we want you to keep that in mind as you're thinking about why we might want to deconstruct the gender binary.
Yeah, I think
And
another. Oh, go ahead, Jake. Oh, go, please go.
And that I think relates to a few things I've seen in the chat where, we have these ideas about, what trans and non-binary identities mean, but a few people brought up that it's normal, right? It's something that has existed like long before the current moment and will continue to exist. But yeah, this idea that it's normal, it's not new.
Yeah. Yeah, Gia, I was just going to reflect that point of like, there's a lot of conversation of this is a new thing, right? Like gender, non-binary people, or even trans people is this new kind of thing for kids to jump on, right? And that there's sort of fear around that. And to be honest, the new thing is actually the gender binary. Long before that came around, gender expansiveness was actually the norm.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think I saw a couple of people talking about how what they wanted to take from this workshop is to go into clinical work. And one of the things that I think is very useful from this idea is that when you're working with trans and non-binary clients, it can be really helpful to connect people to ancestral roots and to a long history of people who are gender diverse and really deconstruct this idea of newness.
Yeah, for sure. And, for those of you who are like, but what about the science?
Let's talk about that.
Let's talk about it. We're going to debunk that for you too, hopefully. So there's a really wonderful article that I strongly recommend if you're interested in going kind of deeper into this to read. It's by Hyde and colleagues, and it came out in about 2019, I believe. But this is a lot of where we get this from, but there's also, they kind of summarize all of the existent data that shows that the gender binary isn't accurate even based on science. So the main things that they highlight to sort of debunk the gender binary is the fact that there's a significant overlap in women's and men's brains, hormonal systems, and psychological experiences. One thing that they said in the article that I think like stuck with me forever, will stick with me forever, especially because I'm pregnant right now, is if we actually want to create a binary based on hormones, we should have like pregnant people and non-pregnant people because that's the most, desperate that we'll get. But still, there's so many overlaps even between pregnant and non-pregnant people. But we sort of want there to be this this distinction, and what we've been taught is that there is this very clear distinction between men and women, but actually with most things, right, we see a lot more within group difference than between group difference. And that kind of goes back to that point we said earlier of there's not only this idea that there's only two genders, but that those two genders are in opposition to one another. And so really science has not supported or held up that idea. Something else is this existence of trans and non-binary people. That's evidence to us, right? That there isn't just a binary. People existing and telling us that this is their truth and this is their identity should also be further evidence to us that the gender binary isn't real. It's something that we've created, and that kind of goes back to that social construction as you all talked about earlier. Also, the tendency to view gender or sex as meaningful binary categories is culturally determined and malleable. As we just talked about, there's a long history of gender diversity that has been intentionally in a lot of ways erased. And so there is this demonstration of that this isn't just something that has always been and therefore will always be. And it can change, it can shift over time. There's an example in here that actually Jan Yoder and I have a book out, and we use this example in there where somebody will say, well, what about, the penis and the clitoris? Like, people have a penis or they have a clitoris. One thing I would say is we're ignoring the truth of intersex people, and the even bigger truth of that what one's penis and clitoris looks like widely differ across folks who we've labeled as men or women or male or female. But interestingly, there's also this idea of like a clitoris is less than 1 centimeter long, and that's how we determine that. And then a penis is 3 to 5 or 3 to 4.5 centimeters long. But there's all these people in the middle who are they, right? Where do they fall, right? There's many people who their genitalia don't match that norm. And actually, there was a study in 2000 that looked at 500 men and found that only 55% of them fit within the normal range, which 55% is just slightly above half, right? And so is that really a norm if it's only even falling within about 55% of folks who are labeled as men? So, just something for you to chew on and think about. But basically what science is even telling us is that this gender binary is something that we really need to deconstruct.
Absolutely. So we want to talk a little bit about what cissexism looks like manifest in our society. So we'll talk about some of the main messages of cissexism and then how they manifest both individual or interpersonally and structurally. So some of the main messages of cissexism, which Nic defined for us earlier, are sort of invalidation of trans identities, trans non-binary realities. So we see a lot of stereotyping around trans and non-binary people experiencing mental health concerns. In fact, I think the DSM in some way has perpetuated this stereotype. We see people being invalidated through misgendering and refusal to use names and pronouns and identity labels respectfully. We see cissexism in the exclusion of gender nonconformity, so denying trans and non-binary people access to traditionally gendered spaces, whether that's bathrooms, whether that's music festivals, whether that's sort of on a small or a large scale, or just policing gender behavior to conform. So telling people that what they're doing doesn't conform to what a man should be or what a woman should be. And policing androgynous behavior overall. And then I think some of the really modern stereotypes, well, maybe they're not new either, but modern manifestations of cissexism, particularly in media, tend to portray trans and non-binary people as purposefully deceptive, particularly like with malicious intent. So if you have not seen the documentary Disclosure, I highly recommend it. It talks about how trans people and particularly trans women have been portrayed in media throughout history as being deceptive in order to be predators, basically. And we know based on the research that that's not at all based in reality, but it does show up in people's stereotypes and biases towards trans and non-binary people. Another kind of stereotype that we see commonly, my dog just joined us, is this stereotype of trans and non-binary people as attention seeking, demanding. And I think this really ties in with other political stereotypes as of, people who are demanding human rights and basic respect as being unrealistic, unreasonable, kind of snowflakes. And so we want to draw your attention to these messages and these stereotypes so that you can notice when they're coming up in yourself, in your writing, in your work with clients, or even if you're not the one perpetuating it. We know that one of the main ways that oppression can be harmful is through internalized messages. So clients or people in your life who are trans and non-binary might be encountering these messages internally as well, after receiving them from the external world for so long. And so, like I mentioned, these things, just like any other form of oppression, like racism or heterosexism or sexism, take place on both interpersonal and structural levels. So we can think of biases and microaggressions that might come out in day-to-day language. So even if you're well-intentioned and not meaning to be harmful, these underlying messages of cissexism might come out. It might be outright prejudice and discrimination, using slurs, misgendering people intentionally. And then we can also look towards structural and systemic cissexism. So, for example, there's still no federal legislation that protects trans and non-binary people from discrimination. So trans and non-binary people can be evicted, can be fired, can be released from all sorts of different positions, or not hired at all, just on the basis of being trans or non-binary in many states in the country. And unfortunately, the situation is actually worsening in many places as opposed to getting better. So just for example, in 2022, there have been over 120 pieces of state legislation proposed, not all passed, thankfully, that have been proposed to restrict the rights of trans people. And so some of the main kind of themes of those legislation are restricting access to public spaces like bathrooms and locker rooms, particularly in public spaces like schools, restricting access to participation in athletics, especially for children, and restricting access to gender-affirming medical care for children and adults. And so this is something that has a really intense effect because it is systemic. And so it might be useful for you to look up your state or the states where you see clients or where you teach or practice otherwise, and just take a look at what some of these pieces of legislation look like in your local area. Okay. Anything you want to add before we keep going? Okay.
Great. So we're going to come back to this later, but something we just wanted to point out was some of you might be familiar with the gender minority stress model, but there has been some additions to the model by Testa and colleagues in 2015, and they presented the gender minority stress and resilience model. And so this is an overview of what the model looks like. It's, again, very familiar to the minority stress model, but just specifically highlights the things that may be affecting trans and non-binary folks. So the things we really want to think about is possibly how are we contributing to this? And things like gender-related discrimination, gender-related rejection. So being, discrimination, not using somebody's pronouns that they have shared are their pronouns, could be an example of discrimination. Not allowing individuals who are trans to be involved in a certain organization, or we see this happening in sports, right? So if somebody's a trans woman, there's a lot of controversy of whether they should be allowed to be involved in women's sports. Gender-related rejection, maybe having your family reject you because you've come out as your true identity, or having friends who leave you. Gender-related victimization, having someone attack you physically, emotionally, sexually because of your gender identity, and non-affirmation of one's gender identity. So refusing to believe them that is their gender identity. So these are things we really want to think about, and like, what even maybe subtle ways are we sending this message, or are we contributing to these stressors that can lead to negative mental and physical health outcomes for trans and non-binary folks? Okay.
All right, so continue to reflect on that. Feel free to share some things in the chat too, especially I saw some people talking about kind of what this looks like in AWP, or if you have questions about that, feel free to add that. I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with research with trans and non-binary folks, but we did just want to talk about it briefly. Cissexism is a system that harms people of all genders, including cisgender folks. So for example, like as a cis woman, cissexism still enforces the idea that gender is essential, and therefore constricts anyone's gender expression, gender representation, and play with gender. But cissexism definitely harms trans and non-binary people disproportionately. So just some recent research that we wanted to highlight for you all, that basically accounts for the model that Nic just shared. So among trans and non-binary youth, the more places that trans and non-binary youth had their pronouns and names respected, including school, home, work, and with friends, the more there were places where they were gendered correctly, the less likelihood it was that they reported suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. So we know that using gender labels correctly actually has a direct impact on people's mental health and suicidality. Among a national sample of trans people that looked at homelessness, the rates of homelessness were almost double for those who had a non-affirming family compared to those whose family were accepting, supportive, and engaged. In the past 12 months, 30% of trans respondents to that same survey, those who were at one point employed, 30% reported having been fired, denied a promotion, harassed, or assaulted in the workplace. And then in schools, over 2/3, actually over 3/4 of trans participants who were out during their K through 12 years reported discrimination, harassment, or assault at school, many of whom ended up leaving school, dropping out altogether. And so the impacts of the discrimination that Nic just covered are, they're just astonishing, and I think make it really clear to us as psychologists, social workers, and other helping professionals that deconstructing cissexism is a necessary part of mental and public health altogether. So we won't spend a ton of time on this slide, but we do want you to just think about, in your role, whatever that might look like, and you probably have multiple roles depending on what you do, where might cissexism come up? How might it influence your thinking in your role, the outputs of your role, your work with other people? And these are things that you're welcome to share in the chat or ask questions about in the Q&A. But while you think about that, we will probably keep moving because time is moving quickly. So Nic and I are both going to talk about sort of some research areas that are actually near and dear to our hearts and how they connect, quote unquote, women's rights with deconstructing the gender binary.
Yeah, so one thing that comes up a lot, and something that we kind of touched on earlier, is this fear of, if we lean into kind of deconstructing the gender binary and being more inclusive of gender, is that we're going to forget about the things that so many folks have been fighting for decades. And from our point of view, we actually think this is kind of the way to continue that work and to expand that work. And we're so grateful for the work that has been done. So my area of focus in terms of research and clinical work is focused on gender-based violence. And to be totally honest with you, when I first started this work during my undergrad and then graduate training, I really saw that to be synonymous with violence against women. And so that was a lot of the work that I did. However, as I've really learned and grown and read, I now see that as that's a part of it, but also another part of it is thinking about violence against trans individuals. And unfortunately, we have ridiculously high rates still, even after all the work that has been done, of violence against cisgender women. So that's still a really important thing for us to focus on. And unfortunately, when we look at rates of trans and non-binary folks' experiences of violence, we see even larger rates of violence. So the most representative samples that we have to date have demonstrated that 47%, so much, almost half, 1 in 2, of trans individuals have experienced sexual assault at some point in their lifetime. That is a huge issue and something that does not take us away from focusing on cis women's experience of sexual assault, but rather says this is a bigger problem than we've even been talking about or we've even been acknowledging. And we need to come together to really figure out how do we create change so this isn't something that's so astonishing. Again, intimate partner violence is more than 1 in 2. So about 54% of trans individuals have experienced intimate partner violence during their lifetime. So again, thinking about how can we take the amazing work that has come up and has been done for so long, focused on women, and really think, okay, and how is this different for trans and non-binary folks, right? How do we expand this? And therefore, I really think having that come together will make us move forward even more and reduce those rates of violence against cis women as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to think about solidarity and coalition building, and how if we can deconstruct the systems of power that allow sexual and intimate partner violence to take place, the outcomes will benefit people of all genders. Absolutely. That's a good question in the chat around perpetrators of violence against trans folks. My most recent look at the research is that the majority of perpetrators are cis men, reported to be cis men. So
yes,
yeah. So I'll talk just briefly about another kind of issue that tends to be conceptualized as a women's rights issue, and which we can conceptualize as an issue that includes cis women, trans men, non-binary folks, and really everyone, which is reproductive health. So my research is in abortion access, reproductive justice, and making sure that people have access to the reproductive lives that they want to have access to. We do know that the majority of people who access, for example, abortion care in the US are cis women, but trans men and non-binary people who are assigned female at birth, as well as other gender nonconforming people, also need access to reproductive health care, such as screenings for reproductive related cancers, access to birth control and other contraceptives, and then access to prenatal care, birth care, and abortion care. Unfortunately, because these spaces are often so gendered, I mean, we can think about clinics that are called women's healthcare clinics or have women in the title. Those spaces become hostile to, or can be hostile to, or to a lesser extent, maybe just unwelcoming to trans non-binary folks who aren't women. And so I think, again, if we can build a coalition based on reproductive autonomy and reproductive justice, then we can include people of all genders who deserve reproductive care, including access to abortion. All right. And then maybe we'll cover this super quickly so that we can get to the end here. But another really cool area of research that we wanted to highlight is Hoskins' research on femphobia and anti-femininity. So we know that feminists for, decades and decades have been fighting against gender essentialism and this idea that women need to be feminine. Hoskins' research has really highlighted how anti-femininity attitudes end up harming people of all genders. It devalues anything that is feminine. It victimizes people who present as feminine. And it makes what is feminine seem superficial and unimportant. And so just as feminists over, the last 70 years have fought for people to be able to express genders in all ways, when we bring trans and non-binary people into that conversation, we might be able to achieve even greater fluidity with our gender expression, kind of reinforcing that masculinity and femininity and androgyny are all valid ways of being, and we can play with them and embody them to the extent that feels right for us. So,
do we want to?
Oh, go ahead.
Do you think we should leave this as like a encourage people to do, or just given the time?
Yeah, whatever you think.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Yeah. So maybe as you are maybe this is something to do after we close out for today, because we do want to save a couple minutes for questions. After we've closed out from the webinar today, we want to encourage you to think about what the world would look like if cissexism and the gender binary didn't exist, if we had deconstructed them and they were no longer having all these detrimental effects that we've talked about today. What would that look like in your personal life, in your professional life, or just broadly across the world? And what would it take to move closer to that vision? What might it take from you personally to move us towards that future? And in particular, if you are, thinking about how this might manifest within AWP, we want to challenge you on that facet as well. Like, what would it look like if there was no enforcement of the gender binary within AWP? And what might be our role in achieving that future? Yeah. Okay.
All right, and the last thing we want to do before we turn it over to you all for questions is to bring us back to that gender minority stress and resilience model, because thankfully this model has some information for us that might help with that visioning exercise of what can we do to try and impact the effects of these distal factors that society is contributing, and we might within ourselves be contributing, that then lead to the internalization of those factors or the negative expectations or concealment of identity that again lead to negative mental and physical health outcomes, as we've highlighted. So the two things that Testa and colleagues found that really led to less mitigated or reduced the impacts of these things on trans and non-binary folks' mental and physical health were community connectedness and pride. And this really stood out to us because we can be a part of that community. We can be a part of that place where people, and I always get choked up when I think about this, we can be an organization where people come and they feel proud of who they are, and they feel accepted for who they are. And they know that they can go to an AWP conference and be seen. And so I think it's really important for us to think about how can we move towards that as an organization, because I think we really can. So, okay. Well, on that note, we're going to turn it over to you all for your questions. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Gia to let us know what questions came up.
Yeah. So there are a few questions, and I'm going to try to get through the ones that I have now, and feel free to just keep putting them in the Q&A. So one we had was wanting to know a bit about how deconstructing the gender binary is how we can consider anti-racism work and how those two things can, speak to each other and work with each other.
It's a really good question. And I saw that comment. I think there's importance of acknowledging that there is some really strong assumptions of gender binary within marginalized groups. And I think the thing for me is to respect one's culture, right? So always invite them to share about their experiences and their reality. And, they don't necessarily have to change their beliefs, so it's not our job to get people to change their beliefs, but maybe to help people know that they can change their beliefs, and also that to help them respect other people whose beliefs might be different than theirs. And the thing that comes back to me, I know there was a question about language too, of like gendered language, and so it reminds me of colonization. And so unfortunately, there's rich histories of various cultures that have been erased and colonized to be very different than maybe what they would have been without colonization. And so I think it's also important to help us support our clients and support our folks in our lives to think about the role of colonization. So, a part of why there's been some movement away from Hispanic identity, but of course people can identify how they can, but because Hispanic basically means Spanish speaking, and the Spain or this colonized a lot of countries that are currently Spanish speaking. And so the gendered nature of that doesn't necessarily mean that those cultures that were colonized hold those views as well, but rather what was placed on folks through the colonization process, which if you look at that PBS link, you can see that there was a lot of richness and diversity in gender before colonization, and still today for folks that have been able to maintain that history, often through storytelling, because it's really been destroyed from the historical record.
Yeah. One other thing that comes to my mind, when we think about the utility of intersectionality as a model, is that we know that systems of power intersect. And so cissexism intersects with racism. And, back to the idea of violence, we know that Black trans women have the highest rates of surviving and not surviving, sadly, violence. And so I think that's a clear representation of how folks who are marginalized by both gender and race end up being disproportionately impacted by the systems that we're all trying to fight that enable violence.
I'm just going to butt in because I know with time we're at the last minute. And so I know, Gia, there were so many good questions in there that folks had that we didn't get to. And so maybe that'll be for part 2, or I think you all were going to maybe have this space again at the conference in Atlanta. And so just encouraging everyone to sort of stay engaged with that. I don't know, Nic or Elyssa or Gia, any last thoughts you want to end with as we let folks go at the top of the hour?
I think what I will say is I'm going to put my email in the chat. Elyssa just did this. So if there are questions that unfortunately we didn't get to today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And we really want to engage in this conversation. And to Gia's point, engage in it from a point of dialogue, not a point of debate. So we really encourage folks to reach out to us. We're very open to it, and we would love to continue this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Tiffany said, since we are going to be doing this, we also did this last year in a 4-hour model for a pre-conference. We'd love to do that again. And so if there's things that you really wish we had covered that you want more information on, not only can you ask us questions about it, let us know so that we can include that in future iterations of the workshop so that we can do better in the future.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
I guess just the one last thing is that a lot of folks, the questions that didn't get answered were about what we do at AWP. And I think this is something that a lot of us are thinking about, and it's going to be a community project, right? How do we, hold space for people to learn while making sure our trans and non-binary colleagues and friends are able to be at AWP safely? How do we figure out when growth just isn't possible right now? And so these are things that I'm thinking about, and I know the other folks here are thinking about, and we will have to continue to work on.
Yeah, we have a working group. And so if folks are interested in helping with this, I encourage you to send an email to me as well. And I can let you know kind of what we're doing and if you're interested in getting involved in that work.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it'll take all of us. All right, it's 11:01 in the Pacific time, so I know it's late for you all. So I'm gonna end this, and we'll all disappear in a moment. But thank you everyone for coming out and spending your time doing this today.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick
all.
and Elyssa and Gia.
So